Hey everyone, this is a review by Michal R. Krätke. At least that's my best pronunciation of his name. It's a review of Karl Korsch's collected letters, um, edited by Michael Buckmiller, Michel Pratt, and Micah G. Werner. This was published in 2001. In 1978, Michael Buckmiller from the University of Hanover started editing the complete works of Karl Korsch. By then, Korsch was already a legend. A lot of his writings had been republished in various forms, especially those from the years 1918 to 22, when he was actively engaged in the struggle for socialization in Soviet or Workers' Council and democracy in Germany. He gained further respect as a leading critic of both versions of Marxist orthodoxy, Leninism and Kautskyism, whose deeply rooted affinity he exposed in spite of official polemics. Korsch's writings, especially a small volume on Karl Marx, published in English in 1938 for the first time, were rediscovered and devoured by young aspiring neophytes of Western Marxism in the 1960s and 1970s. For many young intellectuals, particularly in Germany, Korsch became the paragon of a critical Marxism. Korsch's friendship and collaboration with Bertolt Brecht, a companionship that lasted from the 1920s until Brecht's death in 1956, earned Korsch further fame as the, quote, teacher of many left-wing intellectuals and artists in Weimar Germany. Buckmiller was the first to make full and good use of the Korsch papers at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. Since 1978, 6 volumes have been published, all of them with the active support of the International Institute of Social History. Volumes 8 and 9 of the, quote, complete works edition will be followed soon by Volume 4, in 2 parts, containing the writings from the 1920s, when Korsch was the leading theorist of the Communist Party of Germany and became one of the most outspoken critics of communist and Comintern politics on the left. Volume 7, to be published in 2004, will contain Korsch's various writings from the period he lived in the USA from 1936 until his death in 1961. Many of these texts, in particular, a great number of fragmentary drafts for articles and outlines, as well as notes for books planned, are being published for the first time. They include the text relating to Korsch's planned Buch der Abschaffungen, dealing with the possible future of socialism. The final volume, according to the publishing plan, Volume 6, will be devoted to Karl Korsch's book on Karl Marx, published for the first time in English in 1938 in Morris Ginsburg's series on, quote, modern sociologists, republished in New York in 1963. Wikipedia says Morris Ginsburg was a British sociologist who lived from 1889 to 1970, who played a key role in the development of the discipline of sociology. Morris Ginsburg served as editor of the Sociological Review in the 1930s and later became the founding chairman of the British Sociological Association in 1951 and its first president, 1955 to 1957. Ginsburg was president of the Aristotelian Society from 1942 to 43 and helped draft the UNESCO 1950 statement entitled The Race Question. Back to the text. The 2 volumes reviewed here provide a lot of first-hand and first-rate material, not only for a biography of Karl Korsch himself, but also for a better understanding of the life and times of the intellectual left in the 20th century. Of course, it is not complete. A lot of the correspondence was lost when Korsch was forced to leave Germany in 1933, and during his long years of exile, some letters regarded as too personal were destroyed after his death. Nonetheless, more than 600 letters, both from the collections of the International Institute of Social History, and from various private collections are published here, most of them for the first time. The majority of the letters, more than two-thirds, date from 1933 or later, the correspondence ending in 1958 when Korsch fell incurably ill and had to be hospitalized. There are considerable gaps in the correspondence, especially in the 1920s, the years when Korsch was most active both inside and later, after being expelled in 1926, outside the Communist Party. There are just 5 letters from 1924, none from 1925, and just one after 1926. All the letters come with an extensive and meticulous commentary by the editors, referring to names and events as well as books and manuscripts. Volume 9 provides a chronological list of all the letters published, as well as an index of all the addresses and recipients of the letters, and a general name index. For anyone interested in the intellectual history of the German left in the 20th century, Volume 8 provides quite a discovery. It documents at length Korsch's involvement as a young student and budding jurist with Neo-Kantianism and the movement for life reform, Lebensreform, especially the, quote, free student movement, end quote, which propagated democratic self-government of the universities, as well as various other forms of associative democracy in schools, in towns and villages, and even in monasteries. Wikipedia says Lebensreform, life reform, is the German generic term for various social reform movements that started in the mid-19th century and originated in the German Empire and later spread to Switzerland. Common features of these movements included criticism of industrialization, materialism, and urbanization, combined with a striving for a return to the state of nature. Common practices included vegetarianism, naturopathy, naturism, gymnastics, and expressionist dance. While the various movements did not have an overarching organization, there were numerous associations. The painter and social reformer Karl Wilhelm Diefenbach is considered an important pioneer of the Lebensreform ideas. Other influential proponents included Sebastian Kneipp, Louis Kuhne, Rudolf Steiner, Hugo Hupener, Fidus, Gustav Gresser, and Adolf Just. One noticeable legacy of the Lebensreform movement in Germany today is the Reform House, which are retail stores that sell organic food and naturopathic medicine. Back to the text. Nearly 100 letters written between 1908 and 1919 by Korsch to Walter Frenzel, the intimate friend of his youth, highlight these hitherto unknown idealistic beginnings of his intellectual development. During World War I, the friendship was broken. I'm not saying anything for Walter Frenzel. We learn almost nothing new from the scant remains of his correspondence about Korsch's activities during the November Revolution, when Korsch joined the USPD and served on the first government commission dealing with the issue of nationalization, Sozialisierung. the Sozialisierung of German industry, soon becoming a prolific writer on issues of nationalization and the theory of socialism, publishing his first major works on Marxist theory while starting a political career as a member of parliament and serving as Minister of Justice in Thuringia for a very brief period, which became fatal to his academic career as a professor of law at Jena University. The story of those years is told in the introduction to both volumes by Michael Buchmüller. For the period of 1929 onwards, more lectures have been retrieved, and we obtain a better and more detailed view of Korsch's intellectual life and his activities as a theorist and teacher of the left without party affiliations. By then, he had been expelled from the Communist Party, lost his seat in the Reichstag, published two of his major works, Marxismus und Philosophie in 1923, and his lengthy critique of Kautsky's magnum opus, The Materialist Conception of History, in 1928, and became engaged as a scholar and teacher in various intellectual circles of the left, including the Philosophische Gruppe and Studiencircle, quote, Kritischer Marxismus. Korsch's friendship and long-lasting collaboration with Bertolt Brecht, as well as with other artists and writers, dated from those years when Berlin was something of a cultural and intellectual metropolis. The bulk of the correspondence deals with Korsch's life in exile from 1933 onwards. From the very beginning, Korsch contributed dozens of reviews to the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, although never a longer article. Actually, Korsch had been one of the founding members of the Institute for Sozialforschung, remained close friends with Felix Weil, and corresponded with Friedrich Pollock, Leo Löwenthal, and Max Horkheimer for many years, although he remained an outsider. Why Korsch stayed on the sideline of the Institute's activities even after it had been moved to the USA, where Korsch himself arrived in 1936, is not easy to explain. I'm going to give my 2 cents. It's like the Frankfurt School was running out of money, and it was cutting a lot of people's people that had already had money, the funding that they were getting from the Institute by that point. So at least that's what I think would probably be the reason. In terms of intellectual concerns and inclinations, he had a lot in common with Horkheimer and to a lesser degree with Adorno. Since the early 1920s, Korsch had been struggling with the problem of Marxism in philosophy and trying to reestablish the true and original sense of Marx's, quote, materialistic point of view, as well as the scientific content of, quote, dialectical reasoning as expounded in Marx's work. You know, it's one of the things that actually is kind of interesting to me, that I wonder is why in the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory there was nothing on Korsch. Like, there was no dedicated section to Korsch. It seems like it would have been an important thing. He would have had some relevance to them, but maybe I'm wrong. Well, he did actually, but I don't know if any of his studies obviously it's well known that History and Class Consciousness by Lukács, one of the big publishing events of 1923, along with Marxism and Philosophy by Karl Korsch, are big events and kind of still largely still operating within the Leninist framework, but kind of breaking out of kind of positivistic, naturalistic conceptions of Marxism into both of them doing that same thing. And it's always emphasized that Lukács's History and Class Consciousness had an influence on the Frankfurt School. But I wonder what the place of Marxism and philosophy was for the early Frankfurt School, if any. Anyway, pursuing his studies, he became a specialist in advanced mathematical, statistical methods in the social sciences and had acquainted himself with the actual state of the art of methodological debates, the positivism of the Wiener Kreis, as well as American pragmatism. Oh, the Wiener Kreis is the Vienna Circle. Okay. The only specialization he actually missed was economics, although he had prepared a new edition of the first volume of Marx's Capital in 1932. In spite of Korsch's outstanding qualifications and various efforts, Korsch never managed to attain a tenured regular job at any university in the United States. For a short period only, between 1943 and 1945, he taught at Tulane University in New Orleans at the level of assistant professor. According to the U.S. standards valid then, but not today, he was simply, quote, too old. So he became something rather German, a, quote, private scholar, or Privatgelehrter. Although in a U.S. environment, living on a small grant from the Institute for Sozialforschung until 1951, and supported by his wife Hedda Korsch, who worked as a professor of English at several U.S. colleges. Karl Korsch lacked a regular public of students and colleagues. Many of his letters became rather lengthy essays in the guise of personal letters, especially his letters to Paul Maddock and Paul Partos. The hell is Paul Partos? It seems like there's actually a Nick Heath biography of him on Libcom. It says, short biography of Hungarian and moved from being influenced by Karl Korsch to being the keeper of the Spanish anarcho-syndicalist union CNT archives. I'll read it real quick. Paul Partos was born in Budapest in 1911. Paul Partos completed his studies in Germany, where he met Karl Korsch and was influenced by his ideas. In some, his view that the present communist parties are no more than social democratic parties. His, quote, anti-organizational views, that in the present situation, loose networks would allow a rebirth of a genuine revolutionary movement, whilst more formal structures would restrict that, and that the Soviet Union was state capitalist. Paul Partos joined the Munker Corps, work circle, of Lajos Kossak, which had developed in Hungary at the end of the 1920s as a radical leftist milieu, and which included those on the left of social democracy, through the Hungarian versions of Trotskyism to forms of council communism. Partos was part of an oppositional group, quote, the Oppo, which objected to Kossak's failure to give strong criticism of the Soviet Union, along with Lajos Szabo and Paul Justus, Szabo also being influenced by Korsch a little later than Partos. They split with Kossak in autumn 1930. In 1931, Lajos Szabo, Andor Zertis, Paul Justus, Bela Tabor, Karoli Heinlein, and Paul Partos translated and published with their commentaries Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy under the pseudonym of Lantos. Shortly after, Partos emigrated to France, where in Paris he came into contact with the anarcho-syndicalist movement and worked with, among others, Menes Sperber and Arthur Koestler at the Institute for the Study of Fascism. At the outbreak of the revolution in 1936, he moved to Spain, where, under the name of Pablo Polguer, he went to work in the international propaganda section of the CNT FAI alongside Augustin Souchy and Martin Gudel. He was a member of the Grupo Acción Internacional, International Action Group, which asked to be admitted to the FAI in Barcelona in 1937. In 1938, Partos was put forward for the position of Economic Secretary of the Peninsular Committee of the FAI, a proposal which was opposed by the Italian anarchist Bonomini, who accused the hell's his name? God, I've already lost the name. Paul Partos of having formerly maintained friendships with Marxists. However, he worked on the Politico-Social Secretariat of the Peninsular Committee of the FAI in Valencia. Around this time, with Diego Abad de Santillán and Martin Gudel, he contacted the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam in order to ensure the preservation of the archives of the Spanish libertarian movement. He also wrote for the magazine Timón, published in Barcelona in 1938, 6 issues, edited by Abad de Santillán. On the 24th of March 1939, in Valencia, Partos signed as secretary of the FAI one of its last circulars, with a motion on the attitude to adopt when going into hiding after the victory of Franco. On the last day of the war, Partos was able to get aboard a ship at Gandia for England, where he joined the corps of the exiled CNT-FAI in London. Partos was custodian of the CNT archives there, and Jose Peirats, with his help, used these archives for his history of the CNT. Partos also contributed to the Libertarian Reconstruction, published in London, 1946 to 1948, at least 12 issues, organ of the MLE, Spanish Libertarian Movement in Britain. With Zashi, he was one of the first to write on the Spanish collectivizations, Collectivizaciones Constructiva of the Obra La Revolución Española in 1937. Partos also helped Olea write his book El Oro Negrín, the Negrin Gold, on how the socialist Prime Minister Negrin had stolen the Spanish gold stocks and accelerated defeat after the Second World War with information from the archives, as well as using the names Paul Guerre and Folger. Albert Metzer says that Paul Partos also used the anglicized name Porter and speaks disapprovingly of his work for the Ministry of Information, which acted as the propaganda arm of the government during the Second World War, providing propaganda and information on Spain. He killed himself in 1964. All right. So that's who Paul Partos is. With Partos and Matic, although to different degrees, Korsch shared many of his plans and thoughts and collaborated regularly for many years. He renewed his friendship with Ruth Fischer, the leader of the Communist Party of Germany, who had been expelled in 1926, like Korsch himself. Working for Harvard University, Ruth Fischer became a renowned writer on Stalinism and Soviet politics. Again, Korsch became Fischer's highly esteemed advisor and discussion partner in matters of Marxist theory and politics. With a few breaks, they corresponded from 1950 to 1957. That's interesting. Korsch's most prominent correspondent, of course, was Bertolt Brecht, who regarded himself as Korsch's disciple and addressed him as, quote, the teacher, or, quote, my teacher. Hardly a dozen letters from 1934 to 48 from Korsch to Brecht, plus some to Brecht's son, Stefan, could be retrieved. Wikipedia says Stefan Brecht lived from 1924 to 2009 and was a German-born American poet, critic, and scholar of theater. Back to the text. In the last letter in this edition from Korsch to Hans Bunge, Dated 28th of June 1958, Korsch gave a short outline of his collaboration with Brecht, which lasted more than 30 years. Wikipedia says Hans Bunge lived from 1919 to 1990 and was a German dramaturg, director, and author. Bunge became famous through his conversations with Hans Eisler about Brecht. Is Hans Eisler the guy who wrote the national anthem of GDR? Yes. God, I'm smart. Alright. At times in the early 1930s in Berlin and in exile in Sweden, Brecht and Korsch worked and lived rather close together. Korsch was quite frank in his correspondence with his famous friend, expounded his ever-changing plans as well as his rather persistent theoretical views to Brecht at length. In his relation with Brecht, Korsch remained the teacher, as Brecht acknowledged, quote, "You always remain a teacher as long as you live," end quote. Some of Brecht's many unfinished projects, including his novel on the life of Julius Caesar, and from 1945 onwards, his various efforts to rewrite the Communist Manifesto in verse and to present it as a piece of didactic poetry, Lehrgedicht, were warmly supported by Korsch, who sparked neither his criticism nor his generally detailed and lengthy advice when it was asked for. Who spared neither his criticism nor his generally detailed and lengthy advice when it was asked for. See, for instance, his letter to Brecht dated 15th of April 1945 in Volume 9. Brecht and Korsch disagreed on many issues of world politics, especially the changing character of the Soviet regime and the role of the USA in the post-war world, but did so like gentlemen, always using the formal Sie in their correspondence until the end. Korsch's book on Marx, written in German and published in English in 1938 in the author's own translation, had its great impact on the neo-Marxists of the 1960s and 1970s, long after Korsch's death. If there is anything specific about this new wave of, quote, Western Marxism, it is the insight that Marx's lifelong project, the critique of political economy, was meant to be and actually was something much more radical than a socialist textbook on economics, an insight largely due to Korsch. As we can now see from Korsch's letters, Korsch had already started a, quote, rethinking Marxism, end quote, project of Korsch's own, and largely on his own in the 1940s. Korsch's later projects all revolved around plans, outlines, and drafts for another major work on Marx and the history of Marxism, a book in which Korsch wanted to demonstrate the full power of the methodical rule he had already put forward in his Marxismus und Philosophie in 1923, in order to understand and evaluate the strengths as well as the limits of Marx's achievements as the founding father of a new social science. One has to apply the, quote, materialist conception of history, end quote, to Marx himself and to Marxism itself, a historical materialist explanation of Marxism, Marxism's rise, Marxism's crises, Marxism's fall, and Marxism's possible resurgence in different guises, was the one great project of Korsch's intellectual life from the early 1920s onward. In the course of this project, Korsch realized how many and how large the, quote, unsettled problems of Marxism, end quote, were that Marx had left as part of his rich legacy. In this respect, Korsch's correspondence with Roman Rozdolsky is most interesting and one of the most remarkable discoveries we owe to these new volumes. Their correspondence started in 1950 and lasted until 1954. There are some 30 letters from Korsch to Rozdolsky published for the first time in Volume 9, and there are more letters from Rozdolsky to Korsch in the Rozdolsky papers at the International Institute for Social History, which will be published soon. Both were Marxist scholars in exile. Both were excluded from universities and research institutes, and both were seriously and for the first time studying Marx's manuscripts of 1857 to 58, the Grundrisse, first published in the Soviet Union in 1939 and 1941, though their publication went largely unnoticed. These long and detailed, but unfinished, manuscripts, which became familiar as Grundrisse, the very first version of which was later to become Marx's Capital, were crucial for the revival of serious scholarly interest in Marx's writings in the 1960s and later. Theodor W. Adorno and many younger scholars in Germany rediscovered them and realized that they were as important for an understanding of Marx's work as the discovery of the Parisian manuscripts of 1844, some 30 years earlier. Although Korsch did not produce anything like Rosdolsky's seminal study on the Grundrisse, Rosdolsky's Making of Marx's Capital was published posthumously in 1968. Korsch was one of the first Marxist intellectuals to understand fully its importance, especially with respect to the unsettled problems of Marxism. The correspondence between Korsch and Rosdolsky again documents one of the many voluntary collaborations of his scholarly life, Korsch commenting at length on Rosdolsky's work in progress, while explaining the changing outlines of his own unfinished magnum opus on Marxism and telling his friend about his own efforts. Some of his letters to Roman Rosdolsky seem rather prophetic as regards the future development of Western Marxism. Marxism has become, quote, literature, hence a potential victim of academic fads in the style of American social science. The philosophers are back again. While Marx was trying to get away from philosophy and succeeded to a large extent, Lukács, Marcuse, and their followers tried to turn this whole process again and to retranslate Marx's theory into a Hegelian style and language. Parenthesis, see Korsch's letter to Roman Rosdolsky dated 17th of July 1953 in Volume 9, page 1532. Much of Korsch's correspondence from 1933 onwards is an ongoing comment and self-reflection in correspondence with friends on his plans and projects and the various drafts and outlines for books never finished. He also constantly refers to his work on articles and reviews. These two volumes certainly make one eager to reread Korsch. They also whet our appetite for the many drafts and unpublished manuscripts of Korsch that will be published in Volume 7 of the present edition. In fact, they leave us craving this next volume. Michael R. Krätke. Thank you for listening.